We're switching it.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to have everyone here at the
Labor, Health, Human Services Subcommittee on Appropriations, and thank you for our witnesses for being here, especially as we discuss funding for K through 12 education. And this subcommittee is going to be looking at two areas primarily today. Number one, the effectiveness of federal K through 12 funding, and also the importance of school choice. And I look forward to hearing and learning from each of our witnesses about the state of our public K through 12 schools, the challenges that our students are facing, and the trends that these experts that are before us are seeing in the field. America's students are struggling. There's no way to sugarcoat, I think, that fact. The results from the latest National Assessment for Education Progress showed student test scores overall are below the 2019 levels in all grades and subjects. Students have not recovered from the pandemic, and the lowest achieving students are disproportionately falling further and further behind. Matter of fact, 1/3 of 8th graders nationwide are currently reading below the basic level. The current system has failed these kids by leaving them wholly unprepared for the workforce. If this trend continues, the entire nation will suffer socially and economically. Other industrialized nations will continue to outpace us. In too many schools, education in core subjects like reading and math are being replaced by indoctrination. School administrators and teachers are too focused on social justice issues that schools were never meant to address, and not focused enough on academic instruction and academic excellence. Unfortunately, schools are often using federal funds to pursue these misguided, harmful agendas. As I've said in this room before, probably on several occasions, schools should be teaching kids how to think and not what to think. For the sake of their children, parents across the country are standing up and demanding change from administrators, and in some cases, looking for non-district schooling options for their children. I'm pleased that the Trump administration has taken several steps to champion school choice and eliminate divisive ideologies from K through 12 education. I look forward to working with the administration over the next 4 years to make improvements to the overall system. While we may hear calls from some in this room today for more federal funding on K through 12 schools, the data tells another story. The federal government appropriates $19 billion annually for block grants to states for Title I K-12 schools. During the COVID pandemic, Congress appropriated an additional $190 billion for K through 12 schools. On average, federal funding compromises less than 10% of the state education budgets. In recent years, total federal and state per pupil spending on education has skyrocketed. I think we all have to be clear, taxpayers are spending more and more on education, but getting far less results to the students. We need to pause, assess our efforts, and that's exactly what this administration is attempting to do. We have a big challenge ahead as we turn to look at student success. As it has often been said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting that you would get a different results. Well, over and over again, Congress has opened its credit card, and the efforts are not improving the outcomes. I hope this hearing that we have this morning will help highlight why we cannot simply continue to expect more federal support to drive better outcomes in K through 12 education. Before I turn to my ranking member, Ms. DeLauro, for her remarks, I would like to introduce the panel. First, we have Ms. Virginia Gentles from the Defense of Freedom Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome. She will share with us the challenges facing our schools, students, and parents today. Next, we will hear from Dr. Lindsay Burke, who is Director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and her focus is on K-12 education reform and school choice. Glad to have you here. We'll also hear from Ms. Starlee Coleman, President and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, about the strong academic outcomes that charter schools are yielding for students despite limited federal funding. And last, and certainly not least, we'll hear from Mr. Robert Kim from the Education Law Center, whose expertise includes civil and education rights law and policy. So thank you to each of our witnesses for coming here today and sharing with us. We, as members of Congress, we want to demonstrate the respect and courtesy that you deserve, and this subcommittee will have ample opportunities to engage in vigorous debate over the size and the scope of federal funding. But these witnesses that we have here today are going to share with us information within their particular areas of expertise, and I look forward to giving them the opportunity to do that. I would now like to turn to the committee's ranking member, and also serves as the full committee ranking member, Ms. DeLauro, for any comments that she would like to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on how our investments in elementary education have demonstrably improved outcomes for children, and how ending those investments would jeopardize the future success and prosperity for millions of young Americans. I might add, just as a note, Mr. Chairman, that last week, Elon Musk canceled the NAEP survey, National Association for Education program, National Assessment for Educational Programs. He canceled the NAEP survey, and you referenced NAEP in your remarks, and that survey for 17-year-olds. So we apparently are not concerned about student data any longer. I want to extend my thanks as well with a warm welcome to our witnesses, Ms. Gentles, Dr. Burke, Mr. Kim, Ms. Coleman. Welcome to the Labor HHS, that's Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education Appropriations Subcommittee. This hearing is on an incredibly important topic, but I must begin by underscoring that these are not normal times, and we cannot continue business as usual. In fact, the topic of this hearing ignores the outcries of the American people. Because today, House Republicans want to discuss investments in education, while Elon Musk and President Trump are illegally terminating Department of Education funding. The American people are calling our offices every day, asking about the illegal spending freeze and about what has happened to already appropriated funding, keeping in mind that the power of the purse resides in the Congress and within this Appropriations Committee. It does not reside with the executive or with somebody who has been deputized by the executive to have the power of the purse. Neither one has that power. Republicans owe the American people real answers about when their disrespect for the law will end, and not more pretending that this is business as usual. Furthermore, we are on the cusp of an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. An unelected, unchecked billionaire has already done untold damage to our nation's ability to collect, to analyze invaluable information on school performance, including and especially for our youngsters in elementary school. Earlier this month, Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency terminated $1 billion in education department contracts and awards. And that includes dozens of contracts awarded by the Institute of Education Sciences. That is the department's independent research and statistics panel that tracks school performance nationwide. Without IES's critical work, parents, educators, and policymakers are in the dark when trying to compare student and school-wide achievement. Elon Musk is taking a wrecking ball to the welfare of children in schools and their ability to learn. It's unconscionable. I believe it is immoral, and above all, it is unlawful. And that's only where they began. President Trump reiterated that his top goal for his Secretary of Education nominee, Linda McMahon, was to, and I quote, "do a great job and put yourself out of a job," end quote. I refuse to let these hearings distract us from where Republicans want to take public education. The Department of Education is fundamental to the American dream, and that will be demonstrated by our hearing today. So let us begin. Today's hearing was called by the majority to re-examine a question that has in fact been settled for decades. Does money matter when it comes to elementary and student outcomes? Some of my Republican colleagues claim that additional funding for our public school does not improve outcomes, a claim with no basis in reality, and one that is in fact at complete odds with ample scientific examples. A 2018 review of research on the relationship between education spending and student outcomes, this was by Northwestern University, I didn't make this up, found statistically significant positive results for students in 12 out of 13 studies. Similar, do I have the studies? Here, I have them right here. These are the studies which debunk this notion that we're trying here to examine today about student outcomes. So similar studies, Texas, Wisconsin, California, other states have also found that increases in school funding improve student outcomes. It's common sense. Funding that puts more teachers in classrooms to serve students from low-income backgrounds yields positive results. So that raises the question, why would anyone advance a baseless claim that has been debunked over and over again? I believe, as the majority's fiscal year 2025 labor HHS education bill showed, House Republicans are following the Project 2025 playbook and helping Elon Musk reach Project 2025 stated goals of eliminating the Department of Education, illegally stealing lawfully appropriated federal education funds, eliminating Title I, which is the cornerstone of our federal investment in public education and which supports 25 million students nationwide. Let us look at that widely debunked claim again, specifically as it relates to Title I. In his paper, quote, Follow the Money, School Spending from Title I to Adult Earnings, end quote, renowned economist Dr. Rucker Johnson found that, and I quote, increases in Title I funding are significantly related to increases in the likelihood of graduating from high school, reductions in both the likelihoods of grade repetition and school suspension or expulsion, more years of completed education, higher earnings, work hours, a reduction in the annual incidence of poverty in adulthood, that's ages 30 to 40, and a reduction in the likelihood of ever being incarcerated by age 35. The effects on educational outcomes are more pronounced for children for poor families, end quote. Of course, these findings and others were only made possible thanks in part to grants, contracts, and studies administered by the Department's Institute of Education Sciences. So let's end the Institute and not have the data. Perhaps it explains the unlawful and reckless termination of $1 billion in research grant contracts. When this administration finds facts inconvenient, they simply try to change the facts or silence the source. What is even more baffling is that the Republican attacks on public education are wildly unpopular. There is no mandate to remove teachers from the classroom, but that is where they're taking us. A recent bipartisan poll commissioned by All for Ed found that 58% of voters oppose eliminating the Department of Education, while just 29% support such a reckless move. A whopping 68% of voters agree that, and I quote, we should increase funding to improve public schools so that they better meet the needs of students for the jobs and careers of the future, end quote. With only 24% supporting a contrarian view that, quote, we should increase funding to give parents vouchers so they can send their child to the school that best meets their needs. Selling vouchers as school choice, quote, school choice, is a misnomer. The real choice in the equation goes to private schools, who can choose to reject students that do not come from well-to-do families. And then what happens? Where should those students go? 9 out of 10 students in our country attend public school. I implore my colleagues across the aisle, stand up for the majority of Americans who reject the premise of this hearing, who oppose the actions Elon Musk and Russ Vought are taking to make Project 2025 a reality. Stand up for 50 million children who attend public schools in rural, suburban, and urban school districts across this country. In the meantime, we need to get our work done. We are nearly 5 months past the end of the fiscal year without a labor, health, human services, and education bill that can become law. But the funding cuts in the 2025 Labor HHS education bill that has been proposed by the majority would take a wrecking ball to programs that ensure elementary school students ever have a chance at achieving that American dream. From K through 12 education, the majority put cuts of $8.6 billion on the table. Where are they seeking to exercise their so-called fiscal responsibility? Nearly half of that cut comes from Title I, which would result in thousands of teachers being kicked out of classrooms. I do not believe the American people want larger class sizes, fewer teachers among them, but that is exactly what House Republicans aim to deliver. They have also found savings by eliminating programs that help young children learn English, programs that provide grants to state and local education agencies to help schools meet their state academic standards, and programs that provide grants to help students grapple with ever-mounting stress and pressure. Disheartened, to say the least, to see my colleagues take aim at the programs that help their own constituents advance their education, programs that improve the livelihoods of children and their families. And when we sit down to negotiate a full-year funding bill that can reach 218 votes, which the House Republicans' proposal cannot, I look forward to protecting investments in Title I, ensuring a quality elementary education does not become the purview of only the wealthy. This committee, this Congress should be focused on finishing full-year appropriations bills. We now stand less than 4 weeks away from the March 14th deadline without so much as a top-line agreement. The American people are demanding help with the cost of living, the single biggest issue they are facing, and we can do that here. This committee has incredible power to change lives, to help the middle class. We can help make education affordable, to make it easier to succeed in the workforce through our funding bills. Unfortunately, the pressing need to finish full-year bills is not even the most urgent challenge to our federal education priorities. The Department of Education, created by an act of Congress, funded by appropriations bills passed by these Congress and signed into law, and they are laws. They are not directives, they are laws. Ensures that no matter the wealth of their family does or does not have, or whether they have a disability or other disadvantage, every single child has the opportunity to obtain an education. It is the embodiment of what Horace Mann called, and I quote, the great equalizer. The role of the Department of Education is crucial in securing the opportunities and rights of every student in America. Instead of shoring up our investments in American students, Elon Musk plans to follow the Project 2025 playbook, turn public education over to the highest bidders, the wealthiest families, and he is doing so with the cooperation and the capitulation of House Republicans. Families and communities across the country are reeling from multiple crises in classrooms, skyrocketing costs, learning loss, achievement gaps, educator shortages, and epidemics of loneliness and of school violence, and they are looking to our elected officials for solutions. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, cannot be replaced by government of billionaires, by billionaires, and for billionaires. If we want to eliminate the Department of Education, I say to my colleagues, then put your name on a bill to do that. Let your constituents see it. Let us debate it. Let us and the American people deliberate. Do not yield our authority and the rule of law to unchecked billionaires. As we will discuss today, elementary education is an irreplaceable prerequisite to economic mobility in this country, and our federal investments play an irreplaceable role in ensuring the promise of an education is fulfilled for every child in this country. What we cannot do and what we will not do is to retreat from our children's education altogether. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. DeLauro. And now I'd like to turn to our witnesses. You have each been allotted up to 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks. Of course, your written testimony will be included in the full record. So we'll just start, and we'll just go down the line. So, Ms. Jennings, we'll start with you, and you have the floor.
Chairman Adderholt, Ranking Member DeLauro, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name's Virginia Gentles, and as a parent of 2 school-aged children, a product of public schools, and a former federal, provincial, and state education bureaucrat, I've had a front row seat to the American education system's challenges and how it harms students. When I worked for a former subcommittee member in the late 1990s, only 31% of 4th grade students and 33% of 8th grade students were proficient readers. I wrote talking points for my boss, lamenting alarming test results, and I met with organizations pleading for more funding. They got their wish, a reliable stream of ever-increasing federal education funding and steady employment for federally employed and often unionized adults, federally funded and unionized adults. But where's the evidence that the money truly benefited students? Despite dramatic increases in annual education funding and the $190 billion in COVID-era supplemental funds, student outcomes are historically low, and the achievement gap is widening. Our country is experiencing an undeclared crisis in education. NAEP scores have declined for over a decade and plummeted after COVID-era school closures. There is no state in the country where the majority of students are performing at grade level in math and reading. If more money was the solution, why are 94% of elementary and middle schoolers living in districts that haven't returned to pre-pandemic achievement levels? Despite the vast sums poured into the K-12 system for learning loss recovery, 70% of students aren't reading or doing math proficiently, and 40% lack basic math and reading skills. These struggling 4th graders don't know the difference between odd and even numbers, and the 8th graders can't find the midpoint between 2 numbers on a number line. Alarmingly, only 2% of Black 8th grade students in Milwaukee are proficient in math. These scores are heartbreaking. These students likely will never catch up. Our education system is robbing children of the future they deserve. Every indicator shows that it is broken. This ongoing systemic disaster reveals that the U.S. Department of Education has failed to fulfill its mission to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness. By imposing onerous regulations and reporting requirements, as well as a ceaselessly shifting political agenda, the bloated department makes it harder for the people closest to students to do their jobs well. Title I funding began flowing from the federal government 60 years ago as part of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so 15 years before the Department of Education was created. The program's formulas have become increasingly complex, the monitoring requirements have burdened states and districts, and each level of government takes a hefty cut of the $18 or $19 billion in annual funding, while low-income students continue to struggle. Ensuring that all students have access to high-quality education is a worthy goal. Pretending that Title I in its current form has met that goal is foolish. The federal government passed the law currently known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, 50 years ago, so 5 years before the creation of the U.S. Department of Education. The $14 billion in annual IDEA funding fuels a mammoth bureaucratic labyrinth that too often harms children with disabilities while forcing students to hire lawyers and sue in order to receive federally promised accommodations and services. Special interests like the school unions exacerbate our nation's academic crisis. In 1979, the National Education Association pushed for expanded federal control of education and the creation of the U.S. Department of Education. During the pandemic, the national unions pressured the federal government to keep schools closed. And today, state and local unions are closing schools with strikes, blocking tutoring and reading training, and even protecting sexual predators in K-12 schools. Recent coverage of a Michigan union contract revealed that teachers can be drunk on the job 4 times before a union member can be fired. So what should be done? We know the answer is not pouring more federal funding into a fundamentally broken and union-controlled K-12 system. Academic outcomes are worse than when I was a 22-year-old congressional staffer. Instead, we should empower states and families. State leaders are responding to the academic crisis by improving literacy instruction and expanding education freedom. Tennessee just created a statewide education savings account program that will serve 20,000 students initially, with a priority for low-income students and students with disabilities. Congress should consider redirecting federal funding and passing a federal tax credit that would supplement state-based school choice programs. Additionally, combining federal education funding streams could reduce ineffective reporting and resource-intensive monitoring requirements, allowing states to allocate taxpayer dollars in a more student-centered way. Let's stop pretending that the status quo is working. It's time for a new approach that prioritizes the needs of students. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Lindsay Burke. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Chairman Adderholt and Ranking Member DeLauro, for the opportunity to testify today. Washington has been on an education spending spree for decades. Throughout the 20th century, inflation-adjusted per-pupil spending increased 3.5% per year every year. Education spending on a per-pupil basis has more than tripled in real terms since 1965, the year Lyndon Johnson launched his war on poverty, which included unprecedented new federal spending on education. Federal, state, and local spending each more than doubled per pupil in real terms since the Department of Education was created in 1980. And on top of general revenue increases over the past half-century, public school districts have also been the recipients of an unprecedented influx of taxpayer funds in the wake of COVID-19. Congress allocated $190 billion across 3 appropriations, the largest infusion of cash to K-12 education in history. This was 2.5 times the Department of Education's annual budget. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. So how is this money spent? Massive increases in spending have largely financed an ongoing staffing surge. Kennesaw State's Ben Scafferty has documented that from 1950 to 2019, while the number of students increased 100% in the nation's schools, the number of teachers increased 243%, the number of non-teaching staff increased 709%. Teachers make up just 47.5% of all school staff today. Perhaps we would not care about increased spending if it accompanied increased growth in academic outcomes, but it has not. After an exhaustive review of the literature, Stanford economist Eric Hanyashek found that there's, quote, no strong or systematic relationship between school expenditures and student performance. As Hanyashek explained in 2019, quote, while there is some small movement up and down over time, the remarkable aspect is that reading and math performance in 2012 looks virtually unchanged from 4 decades before. Additionally, the gap between the top and bottom decile of students by family income, the 90-10 gap as it's known, remains the same as it was when the war on poverty began, the equivalent of 4 grade levels worth of learning. As Harvard's Paul Peterson explains, quote, the stability of these gaps over such an extended time period is striking. We do not find a closing of the gap at some point over the time period only to see it reopen up again. It does not narrow during the Carter years or the Reagan years or during the boom years of the 1990s or after the passage of No Child Left Behind or at any other specific point throughout those 5 decades. The gap is amazingly unwavering, end quote. So what's a better path forward? In 1998, the seminal Education at a Crossroads report was published after an exhaustive series of state hearings and examination into the effect of federal involvement in education. Several key findings came out of that report. Federal involvement in K-12 education has led to a, quote, program for every problem mentality. It has led to shadow state-level departments of education with 3 times as many federally funded employees in state agencies as at the federal Department of Education, tasked primarily with administering federal education programs. The Crossroads report documented how federal programs and spending had created, quote, a cottage industry in selling information on program descriptions, application deadlines, and filing instructions for each of the myriad federal education programs, end quote. It detailed how millions of man-hours were required every year to complete the federal paperwork burden created by the Department of Education. And to add insult to injury, it found that as little as 65 cents on every federal dollar ultimately made its way back to the classroom. The conclusion of the Education at the Crossroads report was as salient in 1998 as it is now. Quote, it is time for the burden of proof to shift from the federal government if it cannot be demonstrated that a particular federal program is more effectively spending funds than states and local communities otherwise would spend them. Congress should return the money to the states and the people without any burdensome strings attached, end quote. Since the war on poverty began, taxpayers have spent nearly $3 trillion on K-12 education just at the federal level alone. Given the state of American education today, more federal spending has not been the ticket to improving outcomes for students. It's time to chart a different course. Thank you.
Chairman Adderholt, Ranking Member DeLauro, and distinguished subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Robert Kim. I serve as the Executive Director of Education Law Center, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to support and advance public education and the rights of students nationwide. I also served during the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. I'd like to begin my remarks by underscoring the stakes of today's conversation on federal education funding. Millions of American families and thousands of school districts in every state rely on these funds every day to receive or provide critical education services. I'd like to touch on 3 points regarding federal investments in our nation's public schools. 1, money matters in education. 2, the federal role in education is critical. And 3, a vibrant public education system is vital to our nation's prosperity and global standing. On the first point, researchers overwhelmingly agree that increased funding boosts student achievement and other life outcomes. Even Dr. Hanushek, a leading expert associated with the Money Doesn't Matter camp, concluded recently that there was a positive and statistically significant relationship between education spending and not only improved test scores, but improved high school completion and increased college attendance. In addition, studies show that adequate school funding leads to other gains for students, such as increased adult wages and life expectancy and decreased contact with the criminal justice system. In short, sufficient funding really does make a difference in education. Second, the federal role in education is vitally important to reduce inequality and bridge opportunity and achievement gaps among students. States and districts rely on federal funding to varying degrees, but in every case, the federal contribution is significant. For example, the 17 members of this subcommittee alone represent 1.3 million public school children attending schools within your congressional districts that receive $3 billion annually in federal revenue, according to the latest available data. Drops in such funds would be devastating to your constituents, and the same goes for every member of Congress. At the department, I experienced firsthand how the federal government works to expand and ensure equal educational opportunity for the most vulnerable students. Key federal programs and initiatives include supporting schools serving high percentages of low-income students, rural education, parent and family engagement, school safety, literacy development, effective instruction, grants for teachers and school leaders, arts education, gifted and talented education, expanding pre-kindergarten access, career and technical education, supporting charter and magnet schools, as well as promised neighborhood and full-service community schools, and addressing the needs of our most vulnerable students, students living in poverty, homeless and migrant students, Indian, Native Hawaiian, and Alaska Native students, students with disabilities, and multilingual learners, and so on. Also, I cannot overstate the importance of 2 additional functions of the department: research evaluation and data collection, and civil rights enforcement. Cuts in education, research staffing, and contracts limit our ability to monitor educational progress, identify and evaluate the effectiveness of education strategies and programs, and ensure sound use of taxpayer dollars. And freezes or cutbacks in OCR staffing and civil rights enforcement have impacted already thousands of parents trying to secure services for their children or to protect them from harassment or discrimination at school. We must not let the dismantling of critical department functions continue. Finally, it is so important that we preserve and enhance public education in America. Proposals to shift federal education funding streams for public schools to private school vouchers, including through ESA accounts and other mechanisms, are dangerous for multiple reasons. The negative fiscal effects of vouchers alone are huge and have accelerated at an alarming pace over the past 3 years. We see the effects of this already in states like Florida and Arizona, where hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars are being spent on vouchers, while public schools in those states are among the lowest funded in the country. These trends stretch state budgets to the max and threaten their ability to maintain high-quality public schools that are free and open to all students. So in conclusion, I urge every member of this committee to support a strong federal role in and funding for public education, which is so critical to our nation's prosperity and to our democracy. Thank you very much.
Chairman Adderholt, Ranking Member DeLauro, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm Starlee Coleman, the President and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Across the country, more than 8,000 public charter schools serve a diverse student body of 3.7 million students. 46 states have passed legislation allowing charter schools to open, and over the last 5 years, public charter enrollment has grown 12%, and charter schools are delivering results. In 2024, the Fordham Institute and the Progressive Policy Institute both found that when charter schools open, students in traditional public schools also thrive. Their research shows that students in both charter and traditional public schools perform better in reading and math in communities where charter schools exist. This is true in both urban and rural communities. There is currently one program in the entire federal budget dedicated to advancing school choice across the country, and that is the Federal Charter Schools Program. The modest federal investment in this program provides startup funds for new charter schools until state funding kicks in when students arrive on campus. And while the CSP doesn't come close to covering all charter school startup costs, it's a catalyst for advancing one of the most successful, bipartisan, and in-demand education reforms in American public education history. While charter schools have become part of the fabric of urban education, it's important for you to know that suburban and rural charter growth is surging. The CSP is vital to our ability to meet parent demand for public school options in these communities. A CSP grant in Idaho is seeding the growth of charter schools founded and run by retired military leaders, including an Air Force colonel, an Army major and lieutenant colonel, and a Marine Corps major. In Texas, several classical curriculum charter schools have enrollment waitlists numbering in the thousands, including my own child. And a CSP grant is helping those schools open more campuses. In Alabama, the CSP provided startup funds for the Alabama Aerospace and Aviation High School in Bessemer. The CSP is the way for you to show parents in all states and communities, red and blue, urban and not, that you are listening and investing federal funds in programs they want and that work. At the same time, we must be honest about what federal funds alone cannot do, and that is overcome bad policy or practices at the state and local level. Public schools, district and charter, are coming off historic budget highs, and no reasonable person can look at the most recent NAEP results and say that all we need is more money. More money alone will not improve student outcomes. If schools are using unsound instructional practices, money won't help. But making a change to move to sound practices takes money. Federal funding can be a powerful incentive to reform state and local policies so they result in better outcomes for children and keep our best teachers in the classroom. And yet, you must strike a careful balance of not micromanaging states and schools. This may seem like a contradiction. Demand results, but don't micromanage. Funding alone won't solve our problems, but we can't fix them without it. This is nuanced work that doesn't lend itself well to sound bites, but it's the needle this committee must thread. Here are 3 guiding principles that might help as you think about future K-12 funding. Number 1, use federal funding to support students most in need. 2, use federal funding to expand proven and promising strategies that are increasing student learning. 3, use federal funding to show parents that you are listening to their demand for public school options. As a mom of a public school student, I want to acknowledge that you have a hard job. It's hard to know how your decisions will trickle down to my little girl's classroom in Austin, Texas, but they do. And moms like me are counting on you to thoughtfully balance the need for resources with the need for sound policy and the need for the decisions, as many of the decisions as possible, to be made as close to the children who are being served. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. All right, well, we will go ahead and start with our questioning part of the hearing. And of course, as always, we will each member have 5 minutes and to allot up to 5 minutes to ask any questions. And of course, I try not to be too strict on that because sometimes you're in the middle of a question or an answer, but certainly we want to be respectful to other members on the subcommittee, and so we want to acknowledge that. So let me start. I'll begin with myself. Ms. Gentles, our students and parents have been through a lot over the last 5 years, especially during the pandemic years. And the latest NAEP scores paint a dismal picture. As you mentioned, in addition to your impressive career in education policy and your work on the Hill, you're also the mother of 2 school-age children. Can you highlight or maybe talk about some of the particular challenges that students and teachers and families are experiencing in K through 12 education? And number 2, what are some of specific areas where you believe that schools have moved beyond what their core mission was to do? So, please.
Yeah, happy to speak to this issue. My children have attended both private and public school. They were enrolled in our local school district when the school district closed schools in March 2020, and I ended up pulling them out of the district when the district refused to open in the in the next school year, 2021 school year. So huge problem that I think that we've alluded to here today is the fallout from those school closures, not the fallout from the pandemic. A germ, a disease did not cause historic academic failure. The way that the education system, the K-12 system handled it caused that. So I would say we will face the fallout from that, from the school closures, from the disruptive quarantines, and from the general policy afterwards to abandon homework, to lower standards, to just do anything that they could to even try to get students back. Because we are facing double the rate of chronic absenteeism now in this post-pandemic era. So a whole generation is going to be dealing with that. I did want to go back to what I said about IDEA. We cannot pretend that it's working as is. And so when we're talking about the 8 million students, 15%, I believe, of our nation's students receiving services or supposed to be receiving services and accommodations under IDEA, we have to acknowledge that that is broken and that we don't have enough special education teachers. So special education teachers should be compensated well and treated well. We need them in the system. Another thing that we need to address is our literacy crisis. The scores are horrific. 40% of students below basic, while only 30% are proficient. That's a new reality, and I was thankful that I did have the opportunity to pull my children, well, I taught my children to read using the Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons book, which I recommend to all parents. Parents need to be in the driver's seat, take responsibility for that, but I also am thankful that they are in private schools where literacy is emphasized. So we need to address how teachers are taught. When it comes to literacy instruction, what are the ed schools doing, and what does that look like in the classroom? And then you mentioned schools getting off track. That was another thing that we've seen trend-wise. Unfortunately, my children are protected from that because they are in faith-based private schools at this point, but too many educators viewing themselves as activists rather than educators, instructors, and getting caught up in whatever the latest thing is of the moment rather than focusing on core academic instruction. I think parents are done with that, and hopefully we'll see a turnaround in that trend soon.
Okay. Before my time expires, Dr. Burke, welcome back to the subcommittee. Can you just briefly talk about what you're seeing in the data on how it's showing that regarding hiring trends in schools, both for teaching and non-teaching staff?
Thank you for that question, Chairman. So if you go back to 1950, and I alluded to this briefly, there were 2.36 teachers for every non-teacher in a school district in America. Today, it's 1-to-1. So stated differently, for every teacher you see in a typical district in America, there's a non-teaching, largely administrative counterpart. And so I mentioned that 100% increase in the number of students in public schools across the country, and that there was a 243% increase in the number of teachers. And I would just reiterate a 709% increase in the number of non-teaching staff from 1950 to today. So that's largely where the money's
So
going.
what is the overall percentage of teachers that are actually in the schools?
47.5%.
Thank you. All right. My time has expired. I'm going to turn to Mr. Lauro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of points. I think during the pandemic, I think it was President Trump who was at the helm during the pandemic. I think it's interesting that once again we're just quoting the NAEP survey, and we have a crowd of folks at the moment who want to just eliminate NAEP and the ability to make an assessment, which as for you to draw your conclusions from, it just seems to be mindless to do in the agency that can give us the information as to whether scores are going up or whether they're going down, in which we can make some judgments, and which this committee can make judgments as to where we go. Anyway, the education chapter of President Trump Project 2025, authored by Dr. Burke, proposes to eliminate the Department of Education, cancel Title I over 10 years, and convert what's left of federal education programs into a, quote, no strings attached block grant. It would seem from the testimony that Dr. Burke and Ms. Gentles view the mere presence of any federal requirements on appropriated funds as burdens, quote, burdens. But when I consider the programs that this subcommittee funds each year under education laws like IDEA, individuals with disabilities education, I see programs that guarantee fundamental civil rights to students with disabilities, the right to a free, appropriate public education, individualized education plan, parent and student participation. Dr. Burke and Ms. Gentles, I am concerned that you confuse essential protections for vulnerable children in education programs for, quote, burdens. My question is to you, Mr. Kim. You were responsible for safeguarding the civil rights of students with disabilities during your tenure at the Department of Education. Can you explain to parents of children with disabilities across this nation what it would mean if Elon Musk, President Trump, and House Republicans got their way and turned IDEA into a no-strings-attached block grant?
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you for the question. Let me just start by saying that, we don't have to go back very far in history to know what things were like for students with disabilities. Even prior to around the time of 1970, just going back a little bit in time, only 1 in 5 students with disabilities was educated in public schools. There was a problem here where students with disabilities were labeled as emotionally disturbed, mentally retarded, often shuttled to hospitals or asylums. So we know that IDEA, when it was passed in 1975, as well as other civil rights laws in the early 70s, tried to reverse this and increasingly integrate students with disabilities into the American education system. IDEA funding is very specific and very targeted to support students with disabilities. We have Part B of the IDEA grant, which is intended to help states and preschool programs provide for special education and related services. We have Part C, which really is to support early intervention for our youngest children, infants and toddlers with disabilities. And it's critical in that part of the grant to expand enrollment for underserved infants and toddlers, including children from low-income backgrounds and children living in rural areas. And then there's also a part of the IDEA which is targeted to help prepare special educators, funding that is so crucial at a time when states and districts have a lack or shortage of special educators that are well-trained to meet the diverse needs of all learners. So block granting would lead to a lot of bad results here. It would increase the risk that funding doesn't go toward these specified purposes. There would be a lack of accountability over the use of funds. I would also mention that IDEA has long been underfunded, and so what we need to be doing is to get to the authorized levels of IDEA rather than going in the reverse and block granting, which history shows, and we've seen studies, that when you block grant, not only does the usages get diverted to other purposes, but the actual amount for that program goes down because Congress becomes more skeptical that the uses for that grant are being used in a way that was part of the intent of the original legislation. And so overall, the funding goes down, the amounts, the usages get dispersed away from these targeted goals. And I think that ultimately harms children with disabilities and getting them the essential services that they need.
Is it true that the federal government has never met their obligation in terms of providing resources for the IDEA? I can't remember the percentages offhand, but we have never met what we established as the goal between the federal and state match.
That's right.
Right?
That's right, Ranking Member. The amounts have never come close to the 40% authorized level.
Is it 40% of
yes.
the authorized? 40% of the authorized level. We have never met that goal. Is this right in terms of the number of about 7 million students with disabilities? How many children we're dealing with disabilities?
I believe so. I could get you the exact numbers, but we know that that number, it's high and consistent across districts, that every district has significant percentages
So
of students with
that in
disabilities.
fact, they could be essentially losing what their rights are in terms of what we have passed with the IDEA legislation, and turning that around. And we all know what block granting means. We don't have to be educated with that. Everybody on this committee, both sides, knows what block granting is. You take it, you send it, and it's less money, and you don't deal with federal resources. Just make one more comment. My time is long overdue. But this is a pattern we're seeing. Yesterday there was a vote on a budget reconciliation package with the end result of that would be in terms of Medicaid funding, which again would affect kids with disabilities. So it seems to be a pattern here. Thank you, Mr. Kim. Yield back.
Dr. Harris.
Thank you. The only pattern is misleading from, by the other side. That's the only pattern that's clear. So let me discuss some of the things. Look, if our education system were succeeding with increased funding, this has been true year after year after year, we probably wouldn't be having this hearing. But the fact of the matter is, our public education system is a dismal failure on the world stage, a dismal failure. You can look at the OECD numbers, you can look at all the numbers versus our competitors. We don't compete, period. And if we hope to compete, on a global stage, we better fix this problem. And more money and the Department of Education is not going to fix it. You know, someone on the other side of the aisle said, "Well, put your name on a bill if you want to delete the Department of Education." My name's on the bill. We don't need the Department of Education. So why is the Department of Education failing? Well, because it spends its time, instead of promoting reading, writing, and arithmetic, old-fashioned as that might be, because we're dismally failing on the reading and arithmetic part of the NAEP, which I'll get to in a second, it spends its time promoting gender identity, men in women's bathrooms, men playing women's sports. Yeah, go look. The Title IX regulation was published on a Department of Education letterhead. That's why we don't need a Department of Education, because it's not concentrating on what we should do, which is making sure that our students read and write and know arithmetic. That's what we should be concentrating on. So I'm going to ask the first question, and Ms. Gentles, the OSP in Washington, D.C. You know I'm a proponent of it. I have been for years, since Mr. Boehner left and asked me to advocate for it. Could you tell us what percentage of those people in that program are non-white? Because we did talk about this gap. What percent of that program is non-white?
Non-white in the DCOSP, I haven't looked at those numbers for a while, but I feel like it's like 98%.
Yeah, it's either 98 or 99. So let me see. This is a voluntary program where a parent who feels their child is not getting an adequate public education goes to a system funded by the government where they have the choice to go to another school. And it's overwhelmingly done by minority parents. Don't we see the signals that what COVID showed to us is that our public school systems aren't in the business of education. They're in the business of supporting teachers' unions, making sure men can go into girls' bathrooms and men can play in girls' sports. That's what they do in the Department of Education. We don't need it. We simply don't need it. Let's talk about NAEP. Any predictions on what the NAEP results would be for this year? Is it going to show us stunningly going to number one in international competition? No, it's going to show continued stagnation. And we don't do anything with that report because it showed that for years. It shows no progress. We do exactly the same thing, and I think the chairman alluded to this. We expect a different outcome. NAEP is a waste of money if you're not going to do anything with it, and we've done nothing with it for years and years. That's the facts. Let's talk about block grants. Why are block grants a good idea? Because, Mr. Kim, we have a $2 trillion budget deficit, and we better control the growth of spending. And one way to control the growth of spending and reduce federal government regulation is block granting it to the states where you trust, and I know this is a foreign concept inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway, that local people actually make better decisions about how to educate their children. And then in my county of Dorchester County, I trust my Board of Education, not the State Board of Education, which, by the way, supports the concept of gender identity education in kindergartens now in Maryland, and wants to make sure that they restrict the ability of parents to opt out of that kind of thing. I trust my local county much more, and that's why block granting makes sense, because we can control the growth and we can control the growth of federal spending that way. Finally, it was said that 45% of school personnel are teachers. I don't get it. I thought that's what a school was all about. It's about teachers and students. So you pile on more money, you pile on more administrators, you pile on more regulators, and what do we end up with? Students who can't read, they can't write, and they can't do math, and they will never compete in a global environment. It is high time that we greatly reconsider what we're doing in the Department of Education here, and we should do it for our children. And we should do it for the children, for the parents of those children who are in failing public schools. They are crying out for that. And I'm a full supporter of OCCE included in our budget reconciliation, which will put the school choice tax credits into our code, so that we take the position that President Trump has taken, which is every parent deserves the choice of sending their child to a successful school. I yield back.
Well, one could spend a lot of time responding to that,
Don't bother.
but I don't have the time. The fact of the matter is, I hope everybody in this room agrees that we need to do the best we possibly can in educating our children. Frederick Douglass said it is easier to educate young people than to repair broken men. Ms. Gentles, you, I think, made a comment that special education teachers, we need to pay more. Agreeing with the concept that Mr. Kim put forward, that money matters. There is no doubt that money matters. At the local level and state level, education is largely funded by property taxes. In my view, a very poor form of taxation in indicating what people can pay. At the federal level, we have a much greater ability to fund education and other objects and carry out the concept that our Pledge of Allegiance says that we're one nation, indivisible. And we know that children move from Mississippi to Maryland, to Maine, to Florida, to California, with a lot of incidents of that movement. So that we want to have American children educated in a way that they can compete, not only with those states, but as Mr. Harris points out, who doesn't want to participate in the debate apparently, across the world. And we need to do better. And I want to thank you, Ms. Coleman. Yours was, I think, a very positive contribution to this debate and a recognition of how difficult this debate is. Because some of it is focused on who's going into whose bathroom. I ask people at town meetings, when was the last time you were in the bathroom with a man? If I'm talking to women, or when was the last time you were in a bathroom with women, if I'm talking to men? And they look at me like I'm crazy. Maybe some of you are looking at the same way. Because how would I know? How would I know? Because that's the issue. But we spend time doing politically, I was going to say a different word, but which the governor of Utah, a Republican, said was somewhat irrelevant because there were 3 or 4 or 5 people that it might affect in Utah. And you pointed out, look, we need to deal with all the children. I have some sympathy with charter schools. A, because I think they perform a competitive role, which ought to get us to higher competition. So I don't have a problem with that. But I do have a problem if they become drawdowns of resources on public schools, because public schools have made America great. That's what has made America great. That's the great leveling. Not bringing people down, however. I have a grandson-in-law, I suppose it would be called, who's going to go to MIT. He's 18. He's going to go to MIT next year. He's at public school. He got, I think, perfect on math in the SATs, and I guess a 750 or something on the English. He went to a public school. They must be doing something right. But let me ask you, Mr. Kim, quickly, because as I say, there's not enough time to deal with this subject. It needs to be dealt with. We need to do better. We're not doing as well as we should do. And by the way, Mr. Kim, am I correct that we cannot, at a federal level, tell your local schools what curriculum they ought to be following?
That's right. The federal government is statutorily prohibited from getting involved in or influencing curriculum, and that's been the case for decades.
In fact, Mr. Kim, am I correct that if we try to do that, to withhold funds because of curriculum, that's illegal?
That's right. The laws clearly allow the law states that states and districts are the ones that have autonomy and control over their own curriculum. States do most of the work. The federal role is very limited already. The states are the ones that manage their operations, hire teachers, establish their own curriculum and standards through their state legislatures.
Well, let me, in closing, Mr. Chairman, I know I've gone 23 seconds over, say that I'm a strong supporter of Head Start. I think it ought to be in the Department of Education, frankly, not Human Services. Kids are at 3 and 4 years old, ready to learn. The first Head Start program that was canceled for non-performance from 1965 to 1995, the first one that was canceled was by Donna Shalala in the Clinton administration for non-performance. We need to hold educators accountable because they're doing some of the most important things in our country. And we ought to have a positive discussion on it. But I do not see how doing away with a department that is focused on the importance of education being done away with is accomplishing that objective. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I want to just start with just sort of some philosophical questions that I wanted to ask all our panelists. Do we agree that it's about the kids? Would you answer that question?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Only.
Okay. And I appreciate the gentleman from Maryland talking about the best we publicly possibly can educating our children. And I think we're all in agreement on that. So I guess the next question I have is, do you believe that parents are the primary educators of their children and should have the opportunity to choose the best educational fit for their children?
Yes, I've dedicated my career to that belief.
Okay.
Yes.
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 Okay. Well, that's impressive. So if we were in a situation, and I know in our Constitution in Michigan, it talks about a free and appropriate education, a public education. And I appreciate the comments of the gentleman from Maryland that you don't want to take resources from one group of students and divert them to another group of students. But let's say we were able to fund this group of students in public education and also able to fund, using public dollars, this group of students for an education, because those parents felt that they wanted a education that may have a religious component or something like that, and it was not diverting money. Would you support that kind of an educational system?
I'm supportive of education freedom.
Okay.
Yes, every dollar we spend should be student-centered and follow children to schools that work for them and are the right fit for them and align with their values.
Okay.
There should always be options for private and religious education for students. The question here is how do we preserve and advance a public education system, and then, as you mentioned, Representative, to not divert dollars meant for public education to that sector.
But if the funding was there for the public schools, would you prohibit a family from sending their child to a private school or a religious school simply based on you didn't think that the government should fund that?
If funding is there for public schools, that is the one thing that we're talking about today. Absolutely, parents always have the right to attend. They already legally have the right to raise and educate their children how they see fit in any kind of school environment, public, private, or homeschool.
And using public dollars, you would support that?
The primary purpose of government is to fund education and what I think the focus of this hearing is, how important is it to preserve and
Well,
protect
sir, if I could
public schools?
interrupt you a second, I feel like you're dodging my question. I mean, you're an attorney, and you're probably trying to figure out a way to say you do not support public dollars going to a private school. Is that a fair statement?
It's not fully, there's nuance to that because there's always public dollars that go toward private education. For example, with our student loans, they help students go to private schools as well,
Okay.
and many private institutions receive that funding. So it's not a unilateral question that I can answer
Okay.
in that particular way.
All right. Ms. Coleman?
I believe that those decisions should be made at the state and local level, which we're seeing all across the country today.
And then there's something called a Blaine Amendment. Are you familiar with a Blaine Amendment? Or does that sound familiar?
Yes, that was an anti-Catholic provision that was put into many state constitutions during a very ugly time in our nation's history in the
Do you
late
believe it's discriminatory?
1800s. Absolutely, yeah. It was intended to be discriminatory against Catholics and having their alternatives to the public school, which were Protestant schools at the time.
And then,
Yes, I would quote the Supreme Court. They've said the Blaine Amendment was discriminatory, that it was, quote, born of bigotry and should be buried today. And thankfully, we've moved in that direction. And 38 states initially had Blaine Amendments. If you look at a map, it was largely states out west as Western expansion took place in the late 1800s. More and more states, as a condition of admittance into the Union, had to adopt what were known as baby Blaine Amendments. And they stuck around for many, many years, over a century, but now we've finally seen that chiseled away, and we have states across the country that have adopted school choice. The Supreme Court has held time and again that that is legal and permissible and the way forward for publicly funding. And I should add, public funding of education does not mean government delivery of schooling. There's a difference between public education, education for the public, and public schooling.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm over my time. I yield back.
Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses today. I kind of liked how you did that, Representative Molinar, like the quick questions going across. So I'm going to try that as well. I'm going to try to follow your example. So I think you all would consider yourselves experts in education funding, correct? Just nod your heads is fine for a quick one. You're not so sure you're an expert? I'll ask you the question. What % of education funding could we cut? Federal funding. Just a %, quick and easy. Just a number, not a sentence, a number.
That's up to you. You all are the appropriators.
So you don't have a number. Okay, next.
I'll say 90%.
90%, wow, all right. That's almost as much as some Republicans talk about genitalia in this committee. Okay, next, Mr. Kim.
I suppose I can say a negative number, but I would say 0.
Okay, and Ms. Coleman?
I honestly don't know.
Yeah. So you know what? I agree with you, those who don't really know offhand, because it's kind of like a general, like, just throw something big out. Last night, we had a bill in front of Congress that cut 45%, $330 billion from education. Now, Ms. Burke, you think they're halfway there. For everyone else, I mean, I think the problem is it's not an easy thing to do, because if you start going after IDA and Title I funds in places like Wisconsin, where 40-some% of the children benefit from that, either you get bigger class sizes or fewer teachers for students, or you're just going to shift that to the property tax. So we're already going to steal, essentially, trillions, $4.5 trillion from the middle class and those aspiring to give a tax break to Elon Musk and Donald Trump and everyone who can belong to Mar-a-Lago. But now we're going to also transfer some funding potentially to their property tax that people already just got stolen from, so they can pay even more, but through a different form of tax, so that Elon Musk and Donald Trump and all those people who belong to Mar-a-Lago get a tax cut. So I just was interested, because you are experts. I consider you all experts on education funding. I appreciate your honest answers on that. There's one area that I do, and Mr. Kim, you brought it up, I want to do a little deeper dive on, is on vouchers. And I really think there is a difference between public charter and private charter schools. So I appreciate your comments as well, Ms. Coleman, so thank you for that. But, Wisconsin was one of the first states that tried this experiment. And it didn't go so well, to be honest. Originally we gave funding to schools where people who opened up schools said they could put their hand on a book and read it. They put money towards Cadillacs. They didn't, use it for education. There's been all kinds of problems. But right now, state after state, the studies have shown 75% of the people who get vouchers already have kids in private schools. So that's more tax policy than education policy. Once again, we're back to tax policy and dealing with that. Also, in recent state voucher programs in Arizona and Florida, families with the highest income brackets got those vouchers. So it kind of runs counter, I think, to what we're trying to do around public education and make sure that everyone has access. In Milwaukee, when we actually did studies on this, we found that the rates of students who exit their voucher schools approaching 20% annually, and that many of those former voucher students saw academic improvements when returning to public schools. So we've been doing this massive, I would call, scam to private schools. I think it's very different for public, Ms. Coleman. So just know when I say that, I'm putting a big asterisk on this. But there's a lot of schools that aren't performing very well. We also had a study in Milwaukee that showed that there was no better performance levels. In fact, likely just the opposite in certain areas like math in other states, right? So my question, Mr. Kim, is, there's a directive by President Trump to put even more funding into transferring this. But if this is going to people who already are sending people to private schools, we're not getting any better performance out of these schools. And ultimately, these are folks who have the most wealth by all the studies we have. What exactly are we doing in this experiment?
Thank you for the question. Vouchers are spreading at a rapid pace throughout the country. There are 13 states right now in which any student, no matter whether they've ever been to public school, can use taxpayer dollars to attend private school, to be homeschooled, and so forth. And so there's a lot of issues here. One is the amount of state resources, and then if this federal law moves forward, then there would also be federal resources and programs. They take money away from the public system and convert them to uses for the private sector. Now, nothing against the private sector, but here's what's happening. Vouchers transfer those monies. They're actually overwhelming for state legislatures. Once you start a voucher program, we see this in Arizona, the money spent for that, required for that program was 10 times above the estimates for the expenditures of that program. Most of them already paying for students already in private schools, as you mentioned. And when we have these programs and a massive transfer of students from public to private, what else goes out the door there? Accountability, teacher standards, what students should be taught according to academic standards that the state has autonomy in the public school system to prescribe or to set forth what is important to be taught in education. And civil rights goes out the door too, because in many cases, federal civil rights laws are either limited or non-existent as applied to private schools. So we lose accountability. We lose the ability to ensure equality and free and openness of any student, no matter what their background, no matter what their sexual orientation or gender identity, no matter what their disability status is, no matter whether they have learned English growing up or not. And this is what we are transferring the public system into, is that unaccountable system. And I will also add that in voucher programs, when the money goes and the resources and of the state fisc goes toward that sector, you also lose the ability under federal laws to ensure that states maintain their own contributions to education. Because many of our federal laws, they require not only, here we're going to help you out for your most vulnerable students, but we're going to require that you maintain your effort in those areas yourself as a state. And without the ability to do that, not only does the federal money eventually go down for education and state money, but the state's own contribution goes down for education. And this is a snowball effect that we can't let happen in this country, because every competitive industrialized nation in the world has a strong and vibrant public education system. We do not want to go down the road of Chile or Sweden, where there's an erosion of public education and a transfer to a private system that is not free and open to all students.
No, thank you, Mr. Kim. Mr. Chairman, I just think I'd be remiss if I didn't say in Milwaukee, over a 15-year period, 41% of these schools failed, and the average school only lasts about 4.5 years. So thank you for all your comments, Mr. Kim. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about K-12 funding. First, I want to say that it was mentioned earlier, Ms. Gentiles, that providing resources for teachers is important, and I want to reiterate that. We need to empower them. Certainly with special education teachers, they deserve kudos in every way, shape, or form, because it is a difficult job. I also want to give a shout out to my sister-in-law, who is a teacher at a charter school in Oklahoma City, who does remarkable work. And so thank you for acknowledging our teachers. The Department of Education, and it's sort of been mentioned here earlier, has expanded way beyond its original intent. When it was established in 1979, it was intended to provide targeted support, not to dictate education policy from Washington. And Mr. Kim, you just talked about accountability and vouchers in states. The reality is states should be holding their districts accountable. Parents should be holding their districts accountable. It's interesting to me that we're asking Washington to hold my state accountable. I don't want you to do that. I want you to give those dollars to my state and let them do what they do best within their districts. You talked about block grant funding goes down and doesn't actually, get to the student. You know why? Bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is the reason that those dollars don't get down to the student. You've seen programs like No Child Left Behind, ESSA, and others that the requirements to get those dollars are so stringent that states have to file exemptions to be able to get some of the dollars because they can't meet the criteria. It doesn't make any sense. I want to reiterate one point. We keep talking or hearing about student funding being slashed by Republicans. That is not happening. Let me just say this one thing. States and localities provide 86% of school funding. 86% is coming from the local communities to fund education. Federal overreach has added bureaucracy, restricting local decision-making and limiting school flexibility. And despite increased federal spending, student achievement has not improved. And we heard that from Dr. Harris earlier. NAEP scores are declining, gaps in learning persist, schools struggle to meet students' needs. And let me say, this was happening pre-COVID. COVID has exacerbated that because kids were not in classrooms. They were trying to learn via Zoom, which was not effective for most students. The solution is not more federal funding. It is smarter policy and less regulations. We need to ensure that federal dollars where they are needed are spent efficiently with a focus on results. Why not incentivize states who are doing exceptional work? Why not reward them for good behavior? That's the kind of thing we should be looking at. We need policies that prioritize accountability, flexibility, and most importantly, student success. A couple of questions, Ms. Gentles. I want to ask you, in what ways has federal oversight restricted local schools from implementing effective reforms?
Well, we've been talking about onerous and burdensome reporting and monitoring, and I do think we need to be clear that in some states, we hear figures like 50% of the staff is allocated to just filling out those forms that go into some drawer somewhere in the U.S. Department of Education, and nothing's ever done with that. So that increase in the administrative staff at the state and district level, just for compliance purposes, takes away resources that need to be allocated to ensuring that students are successful and that they're receiving what they need.
Dr. Burke, if I could ask you, can you elaborate on how federal education spending has increased while student performance has remained stagnant?
Well, it's tripled in real terms, inflation adjusted, over the past half century, and student performance.
So let me ask.
Stagnant.
So to clarify, more money doesn't solve our issue.
Correct. And if I could take 30 seconds, because
Please.
a lot of myths have been thrown out at this hearing, just to address a few of them, particularly on IDEA. Mr. Kim mentioned earlier that students with special needs were, prior to 1975, mistreated terribly. And I agree, public schools mistreated kids with special needs terribly prior to the protections in federal law in 1975. Nothing that we've talked about or suggested would change anything in federal protections for kids with special needs. What we're talking about is putting funding for IDEA under new management. It has utterly failed. And that management is parents, right? These public schools, Mr. Kim talks about alleged unaccountable private schools. The only entities that are unaccountable are public schools. These are incredibly unaccountable public schools. If you're a parent of a child with special needs, too often, your only hope to getting the services to which you are entitled under federal law is to be able to afford an attorney to go through a very litigious process to get these services, again, to which you are entitled. That is complete unaccountability. We're talking about IDEA, not Title I. So IDEA funding, as I said, we're not talking about touching the funding. This is the law that governs it, that we're talking about, that provides the protections for these students. And Ms. DeLauro, you mentioned earlier that there is an alleged gap between the appropriation and the authorization. You will know, as a member of Congress, that there are numerous programs at the federal level for which the appropriation is under the authorization. Congress often authorizes spending lots of money.
Yes,
we
no,
don't have
I
the money to
understand that
spend.
very, very well.
I reclaim my time, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to reclaim my
if-
time, though.
if-
You've had your opportunity, but I
Okay,
reclaim my time.
then I'll take it up at another point.
Thank you.
very, very much for time to answer a question.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, so I want to yield back, but I want to thank the witnesses and certainly Ms. Coleman for your champion of public charter schools.
Charter schools public charter schools are open?
Is it my turn? Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Just thank you to the panel. I'm Lois Frank. I'm from Florida. That's who I am. Okay. Thank you for being here. Appreciate this discussion. I'll agree with something my colleague just said, which is, funding is not the only important issue, obviously, in educating our children. Obviously, educational policies, the culture of the area, right, of the country, quality teaching. But I want to say something. I've heard some ranting and raving about how United States, that the students here don't keep up with, I guess, their counterparts in other countries. And I want to just respectfully suggest that so many of these countries where children are doing well, they have very well-funded public education. All right, so that is something to note. Now, and I do not reject private education or the charter schools. I'm for parents having choice, but I do reject sending them tax dollars. That's where I stand, because I believe that quality education is one of the cornerstones of our democracy. It equips young people, regardless of their background, with knowledge, critical thinking, and opportunities so they can fully engage in society. Okay, I've given you my point of view. Palm Beach County, my people have told me that if the Department of Education is eliminated, there'll be reduced funding for tutoring services, teacher training, social services, students and families, and college readiness programs. So of course, I think that would be a mistake to do that. With that all said, Mr. Kim, I want to take advantage of the fact that you once were in the Office of Civil Rights, because there are a lot of things going on today on school campuses, both K through 12 and college, that really concern me. The anti-Semitic incidences, which have drastically and dramatically risen all over the country, and we know that there's something like, I think there's something like 12,000 investigations that were currently going on regarding discrimination, racism, gender violence, those kinds of things. And all that has been paused by this administration for what I think are some reasons that one of my colleagues noted before. Anyway, I want to ask you, based on your experience, first of all, why is it important, if it is important, for the Department of Education to take the lead on civil rights complaints in schools? When, if ever, does the Office of Civil Rights get to investigate a private or a charter school? And I know that we do have a Justice Department in a different agency, but there's certain functions that the Department of Education, I know, perform before you even get to litigation. I'd like you to talk about that.
Yes, thank you. It is important for the federal government to have a strong civil rights enforcement role here in enforcing federal civil rights laws. The Office for Civil Rights handles a number of civil rights laws related to the Civil Rights Act, the Title IX, several disability rights laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, also the Age Discrimination Act. So there's a number of different statutes here at play, and so the federal government has a responsibility, frankly, to uphold the will of Congress as set forth by multiple decades to ensure equality in this country, equal rights, and to make sure that there's equal educational opportunity in our schools. The OCR received 32,000 complaints across the country last year. That is likely a vast undercount because, as we know, not every student or parent who has an issue with how their child was treated is going to have the wherewithal or the time or the courage to file a civil rights complaint with the federal government. And so when you think about shifting that burden, that responsibility and burden, because it's a big job, down to the states, now we have to go canvass our states. What are your civil rights departments like? Can you handle that volume of complaints? My organization's from a fairly well-resourced state in the state government in New Jersey, but I can tell you for a fact that they do not have the resources to handle civil rights complaints at of that volume. Just quickly, OCR does have some ability to, as to charter schools are public schools, and so the civil rights laws freely apply to charter schools and charter school enforcement. With private schools, it's a different matter. You know, in higher ed, for example, we know that because they receive federal assistance, that there is an ability to enforce civil rights laws in higher ed to some extent. But at the K-12 level, largely the civil rights laws application is more limited or non-existent. And so there is a difference between public and private. And so it relates to this whole conversation we're having today about the shifting of our public education system to the private sector. Then you foreclose a lot of the federal civil rights enforcement activity around discrimination by race, English learner status, by sex, and all the disability rights laws under multiple laws and sort of basically upholding the purpose of the IDEA as well. And then I'll just mention that, there's talk of dispersing civil rights functions to other agencies like the Department of Justice. I just want to say that I want to share that there's a benefit to civil rights enforcement in education happening in an education department. Many of the enforcement resolutions that come out of these investigations rely once you determine that there's a legal problem that needs to be remedied, the remedies actually apply, what comes to bear in those remedies is education policy. For example, a civil rights investigation involving multilingual learners. Well, let's say the district has to do something to better improve the outcomes for English learners. That requires education policy knowledge of what best practices are to serve those students, whether they need dual language immersion, whether they need other related services, to what extent should they be pulled out of regular classrooms versus being integrated in classrooms. So there's education policy involved in those remedies, and also data and research. Best practices informed by data and research. Not to mention the interaction with school districts and universities all around the country. That kind of relationship and expertise is why civil rights enforcement can't just be handled by any other agency when it comes to education. It should be integrated within the other units of the department.
Thank you so much. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I appreciate the opportunity and the discussion on whether increased federal funding in K through 12 schools truly improves student outcome or whether it doesn't. For decades, we've seen Washington pour more and more money into our educational system, operating under the assumption that simply spending more will lead to better student performance. Since the 1960s, taxpayers have spent nearly $3 trillion on federal education funding. That's a lot of money. Per pupil spending in public schools has skyrocketed since then, yet test scores have failed to meaningfully improve. Reading and math scores have either flatlined or declined, and K through 12 public school enrollment has been on a decline. And the COVID pandemic has actually accelerated this trend. Remote learning was a disaster, and $190 billion, I think, as was mentioned, was wasted. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to spend more per student than nearly any other developed nation. Yet American students are falling behind their international peers. The data is clear. Simply increased spending is not the solution. Rather than continuing to throw money at a broken system, I think we should focus on what actually works, empowering parents, giving states the flexibility to innovate, and expanding school choice so families aren't trapped in failing schools based on their zip code. And I want to give a shout out now to my home state of Georgia, who literally just passed last year and will implement as of March 1st this year, the Promise Scholarship Program. Now, they have capped the amount of money at about $140 million, but that means 22,000 students that are enrolled in public schools right now, in a failing public school, can actually, their parents now have that opportunity to send them to a school that is not failing, so they get a good education. So we're seeing that now. The result, okay, is the state is taking charge and taking action, all right? It's not the federal government. So school choice, whether through vouchers, charter schools, technical education, or homeschooling, forces schools to be more accountable to students and prepare them for the workforce. When families can choose the best educational environment for their children, then the students succeed. We've seen this in states that have embraced school choice, where students outperform their peers in traditional public schools. So I think we need an approach that prioritizes student achievement, reduces federal overreach in spending, and ensures that every student has access to high-quality education. American students deserve a better system than one that prioritizes bureaucracy over results. So, Ms. Gentles, first question for you. You highlighted that academic performance is at such historic lows, such as 70% of 4th and 8th grade students unable to read proficiently, and only 28% of 8th graders proficient in math. Given this undeniable failure, how do you think the money should be best allocated, the federal money?
Yes, and I'd like to reiterate that when we talk about 30% of students being proficient, we have 40% who are below basic. So more students are below basic than are proficient, and that is alarming. We have a crisis on our hands. Allocating funds needs to be done in a way that's student-centered. And I think it was misinterpreted that I was arguing for paying special education teachers more as an argument for increasing funding willy-nilly. No, we need to be smart about how we're allocating funding. So a state like Louisiana that's celebrating education and embracing education freedom, providing options for students, embracing science of reading, improving literacy, both training for teachers, but and then also implementation at the school level, but then also like when they have experienced a challenge with recruiting special education teachers, math and science teachers at the high school level, they've been paying them more. So that allocation matters, not just a big number going up while test scores go down, which chart after chart, state after state shows, but allocating in a wise way. But absolutely at the core, that education freedom has to be there.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Burke, you noted that only 65 cents of every federal education dollar actually reaches the classroom, which is a stunning statistic, with the rest swallowed by bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the Department of Education has ballooned in size, employing thousands of bureaucrats who dictate policy from Washington. In your view, what specific federal programs should Congress immediately eliminate to cut waste, and what steps should we take to ensure that federal education dollars, if they must exist, are spent directly on students rather than expanding bureaucratic payrolls?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. The onus should be on the Department of Ed and on Congress to justify the continued existence of this failed agency. In terms of what programs to cut, we have used a three-part test to determine what programs to keep. So I'll give you the inverse answer. Is a program ineffective? Is it duplicative? Or is it inappropriate for the federal government to run? If it checks any of those boxes, the program should be cut. That means, as I mentioned earlier, about 90% of federal programs that the Department of Education runs would fail that test, meaning they would need to be cut. Those are largely the programs that are competitive grant programs, not the larger formula-funded programs like IDEA and Title I, where funding would be kept but would be managed by other agencies. In the case of IDEA, moving it to HHS. Same with Title I, for example. Data collection was mentioned at length. Move that over to the Department of Commerce under the Census Bureau, where it would make more sense for data collection to take place. And if I could just quickly on NAEP, because NAEP has come up quite a few times during this hearing, just to put the facts out there, what was cut was not the main NAEP assessment for 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds. It was the 17-year-old long-term trend assessment. So it's two different assessments that we're talking about. I just wanted to put that out there to clear the record. And then just finally, on the research on education choice, which Ms. Gentles talked about very nicely, we have studies that are good and studies that are bad. The studies that are good are randomized controlled trial evaluations that show the effectiveness empirically of a given school choice program. There are 16 of those. Of those 16 studies, RCTs, that have been conducted over time, 10 show positive benefits for all or some students in terms of academic achievement. 4 show null results, no difference between the private school choice program and the public system. And then 2 show negative results. Indeed, 2 show negative results. Those 2 results are unique to one state that heavily regulated its school choice program such that quality private schools refuse to participate. And so that's a lesson on overregulation, not on the efficacy of school choice.
Thank you very much. And I'm over my time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. And I thank all of our guests today, the guests in the room and the guests who have testified before us. I'm a former educator. I'm Madeline Dean from suburban Philadelphia. I'm a former educator myself. I'm also a former state representative who paid close attention to education funding when I was there. And I am a firm believer that how we educate our children determines not just their future, but our own. I truly, truly believe that. And so I will tell you that I'm a little puzzled by the opening predicates and some of the arguments from colleagues on the other side of this dais, reciting grim statistics of failure, of students struggling, and then the conclusion, cut federal funding. To me, that is just an extraordinary non sequitur. It doesn't follow that if you are worried about our students, that you want to reduce funding to our students. You want to reduce that which we know, programs that we know are working. So I question both the dark statistics and the extremely odd conclusions. I believe that elected representatives ought to be fighting for greater investments in our students. Sure, look for the waste, look for the redundancies, but look for the investments that are making a difference, whether it's in counselors, special ed, IDEA, investments in our children, investments in our families. So I'm going to try to get in quick 3 questions. Let's see where I was going to start. I want to tell you a little bit about Pennsylvania funding for education. As I said, I care desperately about it for K through 12. Pennsylvania schools receive $4.67 billion. The American Rescue Plan, I was very proud to be a part of, provided, this is 2021, provided Pennsylvania and many, many other states, Pennsylvania with $5 billion in emergency funding to deal with what we were dealing with and what families and schools were dealing with, to support longer-term recovery of education following COVID. And yet, take a look at where we are. Project 2025, page 319 reads, quote, federal education policy should be limited and ultimately the federal Department of Education should be eliminated. That is the wish of this administration. That is the path that they are on. I don't support that path. It is a failure to invest in our kids. It's a failure to invest in ourselves. Mr. Kim, how has federal education funding affected Pennsylvania students? That's my first question, and then I'm going to ask you about IDEA, and then I'm going to ask you about federal support for some of my colleagues, federal education support for some of my colleagues' states. So number one, what difference have we made in Pennsylvania?
I think, school funding in Pennsylvania has been really affected and benefited by the investment of federal funds, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. I would say that we know that of those funds now, there may be some here who say that those funds have been wasteful or not well spent, but the research actually doesn't bear that out. That we know that those funds have been led to improvements of recovery from learning loss. We have to acknowledge that the pandemic was very harmful in terms of student learning loss, and so there was about a half year of learning loss experienced by students all around the country due to the devastating pandemic. But the rescue funds did help school districts recover about 20 to 30% of those losses. That is even greater for low-income students, the recovery for low-income students. And I think, in cities like Pennsylvania, who really did use those funds well to provide things like before and after school learning, summer programs.
The Philadelphia school system.
Philadelphia schools,
Yes.
Academic supports. The gains were much greater. They were upwards of 50% recovery from learning loss. So the research shows that states like Pennsylvania and other states really did benefit from that infusion of funds. It's a small. It was a bump up in the federal share for education in the wake of the pandemic. But usually, historically, if you look at the last quarter century, the federal share of education has been around between 7% and 9%. But it's during times of emergency where the federal government has the ability to help rescue states, to help them provide critical education and services after the Great Recession and after the pandemic. Those were the 2 times where the federal share went up to help states to recover. And that's why it's so critical to have a robust federal role, especially in times of emergency, when we're all scrambling to recover, to get our kids back in school, to provide them with the mental health supports and the education that they lost during that time.
I thank you for that, and my time's going to be so tight here. I want to just note that I wish we would fully fund IDEA. My parents in my district wish we would do that, and they are gravely concerned about cuts to IDEA. Finally, tell us about red states versus blue states in federal education funding, and what would it mean if the red states suffered an extraordinary wipeout of federal funding for education?
Well, I will say that in 2022, the last full year for which we have full data available, about a third of the states in the country relied on federal funds to provide 1/6 or more of the cost of running their K-12 schools. This is like well above the national average. And if you, the states are, I can read them if you want, but they are largely, states that are in the South and states that.
Go ahead. Go for it.
Just a second here, if I can pull it up. It's going to test my organizational abilities here very quickly. So the states that disproportionately relied on federal funds.
Could you make it real brief? You're already over time.
Yes, Mississippi, South Dakota, Arkansas, Montana, Alaska, Kentucky, North Carolina, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Arizona, West Virginia, North Dakota, Texas, Idaho, Alabama, Florida, and New Mexico.
So representatives from those states who are arguing to shut down federal funding for education are doing it at the risk to their own students.
They are the highest reliance of federal funding, and also most of those states are the lowest in terms of the state contribution to education.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing. This is certainly a subject that's really interesting to me. I was previously the state treasurer of West Virginia just a few months ago, before coming here to Congress, where I set up and stood up one of the most expansive educational school choice programs in the country called the Hope Scholarship Program, which has been hugely successful in our state. Now, obviously, you mentioned my state on that list. We are one of the poorest states in the country. That's right. And I will tell you that this has had a tremendous outcome. It has raised our educational outcomes for our students that have used this program. Now, this isn't a voucher program. This is completely school choice. We set up a digital wallet where people can take their portion of state tax dollars and apply it to private school, homeschool, whatever school they want to go to. And it has really, just saved people's lives. And we have people in the southern coal fields of West Virginia that are driving an hour and a half to go send their kids to some Catholic school, which they're certainly not Catholic, many of them, to try to get a better education. Now, you are right, Mr. Kim. For West Virginia, our per pupil student funding formula, 1/3 of it is state money, 2/3 of it is federal money. Now, for me, I don't think there's any requirement. I don't know why we need to have the Department of Education. I'd vote every day of the week I am here to eliminate it if it were possible. What I think you need to do is I'm not talking about getting rid of the funding. Block grant it back down to the states and let the states control the money. It just makes all the sense in the world for us to have control of those dollars and educate our kids the best way that we see fit. And we've seen the educational attainment since Hope Scholarship has come online rise. But in the public schools, we did, at the exact same time, by the way, 3 successive teacher pay raises in West Virginia, and continued to watch educational attainment decline. It's not working. It's just not working. It's not. And we got to give parents the ability to have choice in this country. Now, guess what? If you're rich, you're already sending your kid to private school. This is not what this program is about. You got that choice. You have a choice by the virtue of being rich. You can do whatever you want. This is about those families that are living in the coal fields of West Virginia to have the ability to be on an even playing field with these rich folks, which we don't have a lot of them in West Virginia, by the way, but to have the ability to be able to go to those type of private institutions or educate your kids at home. So to that point, I've not heard anybody talk about this, but Ms. Burke, if you could touch on this. I'm a big believer in national school choice. I think we need to have national access to educational savings accounts across the country. And for us in West Virginia, it'd be great to be able to tap into those federal dollars for our students that are have selected school choice and be out there. Could you talk a little bit about national school choice and what you think that could look like?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Moore. And if I could just say, West Virginia was truly a pioneer in advancing a universal ESA for families there. I mean, we, for so long, the movement just waited with bated breath for a state to finally do a universal school choice program. And West Virginia, following Arizona, did that. So it was just tremendous to see for those families. And to your earlier question, you could imagine a situation in which we block grant the bulk of existing federal dollars for Title I, for IDEA, et cetera, back to West Virginia. West Virginia policymakers could then decide we want to take that block grant and leverage it into an additional pot of money for families to marry with the existing scholarship program in West Virginia. You could really plus up the funding for that program. On your question about federal options for advancing school choice, there are many options. There are considerations around a federal tax credit scholarship. There are other options that are out there, more interesting and newer options like conditioning a state's municipal bond exclusion on whether or not they have a private school choice program. There are populations over which the federal government has clear jurisdiction. ESAs for military families, kids from active duty military families are assigned to whatever public school is closest to the duty station to which their parent is assigned. Give them school choice. That's a national security imperative. Kids in Washington, D.C., make the District of Columbia, which is under the jurisdiction of Congress, an all-school choice district, universal, formula-funded ESA for every single kid in D.C. And then finally, Native American children who attend the worst performing schools in America. That was actually the title of a Politico article a few years ago in 2015, how Washington created the worst schools in America. Those schools are run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Give those children the opportunity to attend a private school of choice.
Now, that makes all the sense in the world. My time's about to expire, but I think we need to have universal school choice for these kids. And look, we've not had everybody leave the public school system in West Virginia. There's a lot of benefits to the public school system that provide, whether it's extracurriculars or maybe certain type of curriculum and things that they do, where they're going to stay in public schools. But at the end of the day, to me, if we don't make these dollars competitive, right? And I've heard, I got sued by teachers' unions over this and everything else. And every time they complained and were screaming about this, it was always about what it was doing to them. And no one was talking about what it's doing to the kids. And they don't have their own union, just to be clear. So we need to have national school choice in this country. There's got to be access for everybody, no matter what, and everybody can access these funds. Thank you.
Ms. Watsman-Coleman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for being here to all the witnesses. I don't want to do a preamble. I just need to ask a series of questions. The first one is a yes or no. Do you support the elimination of the Department of Education? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Can't do a yes or no. Most important is to maintain the funding streams and critical programs.
Thank you. In charter schools, you can accept a student into a charter school. If that student doesn't work out, like in October, September, and November, can you send that child back to the public school from which that child came?
Charter,
yes or no?
It's state dependent.
It's
largely
state
no.
by state?
State by state, but largely no.
If they do send the child back, does the money stay with the charter school?
No.
Or does it go back? Okay, in New Jersey, it stays with the charter school. Mr. Kim, are you located in New Jersey?
Yes, our organization is located in New Jersey.
New Jersey, to me, has one of the most segregated school systems in the entire country. And we've been trying to figure that out, and I've worked with the Education Law Center from the time I was in the executive branch to the legislative branch. And I can't quite figure out why we can't get there, other than we don't want to confront the biggest monkey in the room. And that monkey is racism. I believe in choice. I believe in public choice. I believe you should be able to send your child anywhere you want to send your child in the public school system because you're paying taxes in that state. But that's not what we have. We have all kinds of strange things, how to get them into parochial schools, how to get them into private schools. Mrs. Gentles, is that right? Thank you. What is your vision for funding education? Where would that be if it were not in the Department of Education? And can I have short answers, because I've got that question to ask of another person.
So for federal education funding, the Title I and the IDEA could go back to HHS if needed. I think it's worth exploring that. That's, of course, where it started when there was an HEW before the Department of Education. Something that we haven't talked about is the incredible burden that the competitive grants cause. I've heard statistics within the Department of Education that even though the competitive grants are only like 5% of the funding, that half the staff over at the U.S. Department of Education are working on competitive grants. So block granting those competitive grants, sending those straight to the states.
And when you block grant them, where would you put them?
What
department?
How does the funding flow? I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I don't know that labor, HHS, there's plenty of options.
Thank you. Do you, Ms. Burke, Dr. Burke?
I have a strong opinion on where the money would go.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, every single dollar should be controlled by families, full stop. So
How does it get to them?
The best way to do that is a two-part path. One is block granting these large formula-funded programs, and then giving states the option to make those student-centered and portable. So what I described a minute ago is the West Virginia example. And again, I think keeping the formula, a lot of the large formula grant programs, not all of them, and moving them to more appropriate receiving agencies, HHS. I would say that OCR at EDGE should go over to DOJ OCR, that it is duplicative. So there are places
not this Department of Justice.
There are places for programs to go that are more appropriate.
So, Mr. Kim, is not an important function of the federal government as it relates to civil rights in education was to make sure that the states who had no respect and no desire to see that poor children, black children, brown children, non-English speaking children weren't getting the same access to equal education. Is that not the function, one of the functions of the Office of Civil Rights?
That's right. The Office for Civil Rights enforces multiple laws that came up through the Civil Rights era, the War on Poverty era, to make sure that across the country that there was enforcement and equality on these protected categories. And so that was what Congress intended. And then that's why the enforcement responsibility stays at the federal level in the department.
So, Mr. Kim, what's the impact of the elimination of the Department of Education on equal access to education, even though that's a goal and we've not met it yet? What is the impact of the elimination of the Department of Education and the accountabilities in it on actually ensuring that our children get an education that prepares them for the future so that they can take care of me when I get old?
The function of equal access actually runs throughout the department. It's not just OCR, although OCR is a critical agency. There's also units that deal specifically with students with disabilities, with multilingual learners, and even the elementary and secondary unit. All of those programs essentially are trying to ensure access for the most vulnerable students. So to lose that that ability to focus on the most vulnerable and ensure equality would be really devastating to this country. We have to remember that, first of all, the department is the smallest agency by far, minuscule compared to the larger agencies that have hundreds of thousands of employees. There's not a lot of fat in this agency. So it was really the dispersing the functions to different agencies would be really harmful to the public because schools would have to go to multiple different agencies to seek redress or help, which is really inefficient for state and local actors as well.
Thank
Ms.
you,
Letlow.
Mr. Kim. I understand because of the history of the amount of time you've given other colleagues that I've got at least 3 or 4 more seconds that I will use.
I've tried to be lenient to both sides. I
Yeah,
know we're running over.
and Mr. Chairman, you are.
Yeah.
But I've been listening and I've been watching, and so I know that I had a few more seconds. I almost forgot the point
Well,
that I
yeah,
wanted to
like I said,
raise, though.
it's not a magic number. I just try to sort of a cutoff place,
Yeah.
so.
We have a lot to do to ensure that our children get a decent education. I agree with you when you say it's not all about money, it's how the money is spent. One of the things I want to raise is that some of that money that's going to schools now are for things like magnetometers and police officers because our Republican colleagues won't help us get guns off the streets of the United States of America. And perhaps if we did that, we could put more money into counseling and teaching and less into having to protect. And I thank you and I yield back.
Yeah, like I said, let me clarify. I try to be fair, and I guess I may just have to go back to the 5-minute. So
You were good. It's like everybody was at least 58 minutes, 58 seconds over. So
yeah, well, I think you've set the record now, so it's over. So, Ms. Letlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for sharing my passion for education. I think we can all agree in this room that if you educate a child, you give them a future. And so I thank you for all your efforts in that. It's no secret that I'm a huge proponent of charter schools. And as I visited my charter schools, it's been increasingly clear how tedious and costly and long the administrative process is for starting new charter schools. And it's important that new schools are high quality and up to serving our students as these schools are shaping our future leaders. It's also important that the Department of Education is not creating overly burdensome hurdles to the point where it discourages prospective charter applications and hinders innovative approaches to education. So to address these concerns, last Congress, I introduced the Empower Charter Schools Educators to Lead Act, a bipartisan bill which authorizes states who receive grants through the charter school program to use a portion of their funding to support the application process and the development of new charter schools. I'm in the process of reintroducing that bill very soon. Mrs. Coleman, as head of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, how could access to a planning grant and increased technical assistance ease the way for additional charter schools to open in my state of Louisiana and across the country?
Thank you so much for your leadership on this issue. We're incredibly grateful for you. Thank you. It is incredibly difficult to open a new charter school today between the increasing political nature of the authorization process and the cost of new buildings, and as you mentioned, the really complex and burdensome requirements that the Department of Education is putting on new charter schools. It's harder than it has ever been to get new campuses open. So the work that you're doing to ease some of that burden is incredibly valuable for our community. The way that those planning grants will work is helping for existing teachers today in our public schools who have an idea and a dream about how they could do something a little bit different or a little bit better to make a school community that would serve their children or their community well. To make that dream a reality requires today educators to quit their job and spend a full year or more in the application drafting process. That's that's unreasonable. It's a burden that teachers should not have to bear just because they have an idea about how to serve kids better. So these planning grants would give them the support they need while they are drafting their application, so that they can turn in an application to their state authorizing agencies to get approval for those new schools and be ready to roll as soon as the state authorizing entity says yes to them. They can open the doors more quickly and more effectively.
Thank you for your answer. I'm so hopeful this legislation will get through. I was inspired by a charter school that was opened in Northeast Louisiana called the ACE Charter School, and I know that the founders spent over 2 years in the planning process, 250 pages back and forth. And this is a charter school to provide education for autistic students, and the waiting list is through the roof as far as students trying to get in. So I'm hopeful that we can work together to get that passed. Okay, my next question. So over the last few years under the previous administration, we've witnessed parents being pushed to the side, even being labeled domestic terrorists. However, parents truly desire to increase transparency around their children's education and simply have a seat at the table. It's common sense. And rather than opening the doors to welcome parents in as partners, some of my colleagues, outside advocacy groups, and teachers' unions would rather slam them shut and have the government bureaucrats make the decisions. I worked in education before I came to Congress, and I'm also a mother. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that when schools attempt to educate children without buy-in from parents, it leads to disastrous results, and I personally don't know a teacher who doesn't welcome parental involvement. Last Congress, I introduced and worked with my colleagues to pass H.R. 5, the Parents' Bill of Rights Act, which was about finding ways that we can put parents and educators at the same table and have a productive dialogue about how we can help our children succeed. Mrs. Gentles, thank you for the shout out to Louisiana earlier. And Dr. Burke, I understand you both are longtime education policy leaders. How does parental involvement in their child's education improve student success and outcomes?
Well, I think everybody in the room would agree that parental involvement is essential. Studies have shown that it's just a fact in education policy. There's things that are fluid over time with education policy. There are trends that hold steady, that holds true. And unfortunately, we do have a culture now that often is union controlled, bureaucratic controlled, and the system takes priority over the student, and the parents are shut out. And so there are going to be steps that need to be taken at the federal level to address FERPA, to address PPRA, things that you tackled in the Parents' Bill of Rights, and I look forward to seeing what you do in this Congress with that.
And if I could just add, the secret sauce of school choice isn't necessarily shifting the funding, but it is about increasing parental involvement. That's what it does at the end of the day, is it puts the dollars in the hands of the people who care more about their children than anybody else in the whole wide world, and enables them to make that decision. And one of my favorite education policy quotes of all time was from Dr. Patrick Wolf at the University of Arkansas, who said that what school choice really does is it moves parents from the margins to the center of their children's academic experience. And so I think that really is key.
Thank you so much to all the witnesses.
Mr. Harder.
Thank you so much, Chairman Adderholt, for holding this hearing today. This is a very personal issue for me. Growing up, my brother David had an IEP, and I've seen firsthand how the special education funding provided by our federal government had an enormous role in his life. I saw how transformational and life-changing it was to see all the investments his teachers made in him and into the man that he is today. And I'm grateful for that, and I think not just was it the right thing to do, it's actually saved our community and our country a lot of money by making sure that him and others were able to get on the right path in life. And I think it's a little frustrating to hear some of the comments that we've had in this committee today about how what we're talking about today is block granting special education funding to states, shifting funding around. When we're sitting here the morning after a vote that would cut $330 billion out of the education department. So this isn't shifting funding. We're not talking about keeping levels the same and just giving the responsibilities to somebody else. We're talking about massive cuts. Cuts that would be dwarfed by the current amount of resources that we have to IDEA and Title I dollars. That would mean fewer teachers, it would mean fewer counselors, it would mean fewer special education aides, larger class sizes, less behavioral services, and ultimately worse educational outcomes for kids like my brother, the most vulnerable kids in our classroom. And frankly, it makes me a little angry when I hear folks talking about moving the ball around and trying to hide what this funding is actually meaning, when in reality, we're talking about cutting resources for the kids that need it most. So I'd really just love to have a little bit more clarity from our witnesses here today about what this is going to mean for our students and whether or not they actually support what we actually saw happen in Congress last night, which was a cut to the Department of Education and a massive cut ultimately to special education resources that are going to kids. Dr. Burke, do you support gutting and cutting funding for special education? Yes or no?
No, I support putting those dollars in the hands of parents.
Great. So you would have voted no on the bill last night.
No, look, that's not what was in the bill. First of all, this is a reconciliation bill where you can only tackle mandatory
Do you
spending.
support cutting $330 billion from the department?
Mandatory
Ma'am,
spending
yes or
in
no?
IDEA, and so all that was tackled in that budget bill was higher education spending. So I think we're probably talking about two different proposals.
So you do not support cutting $330 billion from the Department of Education?
First of all, 330 million, you said, or billion?
Billion.
Billion? The Department of Ed's budget's less than 100 billion. So there's literally no way they could have cut 300 billion from the Department of Ed. So the budget, there's no way that they cut 330 billion from the Department of Ed with discretionary spending, because that cannot happen in that particular proposal. So, but I would support taking those existing federal dollars for students with special needs and putting those dollars in the hands of families to choose an appropriate public education or private education for their children.
Your opposition is noted, and thank you. I'm great. It's great to hear that you do not support cutting IDEA funding, which is in opposition to where most of the members of this committee are. Ms. Coleman, do you support cutting higher education funding, or special education funding, rather?
No.
Tremendous. Ms. Gentles?
Absolutely not. As you might have seen in my testimony, I had a child with an IEP, cried in my car after every meeting. I don't think that the IDEA process is working. I know it's not. Parents have to sue to get services and accommodations, but IDEA is essential, and let's get that funding allocated in a way that serves students.
Great. Mr. Kim?
Absolutely not. And we need to also worry about how IDA funding not only would be reduced with the upcoming budgets, but also converted into block grants or vouchers, because that would then frustrate the IDEA itself, because those entities receiving those grants, if they remained for special education purposes, would no longer be subject to the IDEA. So there's a lot of danger here in not only reducing, but in shifting the way the money is distributed that could lead to an exodus from the civil rights protections that this federal government has erected over the last 60 years.
Well, thank you. But I think the most important point that I'd like to make is that we're not talking about a shift. We're not talking about keeping funding levels the same. I think it's a little disingenuous to act like that's what the discussion is actually about when we are the morning after a vote that would advance an agenda to cut enormous amounts of money from education and ultimately from Title I and special education programs, because there's only one way that we can make that work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Okay, well, I think we had a very good hearing. Mr. Laura, I think you will make some closing, but I am speaking, and I have got to leave in about a minute. So if you could keep your comments to a minute.
It's going to be.
Yeah, I just, like I said, yeah.
I'll be very clear. Ms. Coleman, first of all, I want you to know I do support charter schools. I do not want charter schools to supplant public education, where 90% of our kids are. But there is a role for public charters. But the fact of the matter is that we can't move in a direction that supplants our public education system. You should know about this subcommittee. On the Republican side, there was an amendment a number of years ago, the Massey Amendment, and that said, let's cut all federal funds for K through 12 education. I don't know if any of you agree with that, but I will tell you there was one person who was not in the Congress at the time, and there are 8 people on this committee. One was not here, but 5 of the 7 remaining people voted to take out federal resources for K through 12 education. It's a reality. 166 Republican members did that. 5 of 7 on this committee. It's about $42 billion. So the notion that we can just willy-nilly cut education, it's consistent. It's not a one-off, and so forth. Now, you know, Dr. Berg authored the Project 2025 a piece on education. So quite honestly, it doesn't surprise me that you would look at things that mislead us in terms of justifying what is an ideological goal of cutting public education for 50 million American kids. You would cut 90%, mostly competitive grants. $6 billion of the $44 billion are competitive grants. K through 12, special education are competitive grants. So to be straight with us, 90% cut to the department means Title I and IDEA are on the chopping block. In terms of appropriations and the bills that are coming up right now, there is a $4.7 billion cut to Title I. I will just say IDEA is level funded. There is a claim that 40% of the budget supports teachers. National Center for Educational Statistics shows teachers and principals are 66% of all school systems. That doesn't count instructional coordinators, custodians, or bus drivers. Now, this is an effort that Mr. Musk would like to cut. My colleagues have talked about the $330 billion. Just this last comment, Mr. Chairman, the Crossroads report. Secretary of Education, Richard Riley, and I quote him, "It is disheartening to see some of the same people who work to abolish the Department of Education using these kids of desperate last-minute attacks to undermine our work to build effective strategies for improving student achievement." The goal, the overall goal that is represented here in some respects, not everyone, and members of this committee and on the other side of the aisle, and what we're seeing coming forward with what happened last night, is there is a deliberate attempt to cut the funding for public education in this country. And it is where 90% of the students are, and it is where, and that cuts back the American dream. And that means let's move to private education. Let's take it out of the realm of public education and serving every single child in this country, and not those few who can get a, you know, it was Claiborne Pell to the manor born, who said, let's give the opportunity for low-income kids, middle-income families to get their kids to school. Some of you here would deny that opportunity, and clearly the Republican majority in this Congress would deny that opportunity for our children. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman. I
obviously,
hope you have
everyone
good
has a lot of
speech.
strong feelings on education, and thanks to all of our panelists for being
great
here.
speech.
Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to working with you as we work on trying to make education great again. Thanks.
Thank you.